Good morning. There you go. All right. Thank you all for being here. I was a little worried when we started right at 11. There were like 3 people here. I was like, where did everybody go? Did they hear us preaching? I'm very glad to be here this summer as an intern. I'm so glad to be here preaching today. I'm so grateful for y'all for being here. In the weeks leading up to this sermon, I have had my pawpaw, my Chinese grandmother, on my mind and my heart continually. I think we have a photo of her. There she is. That's her. That's me as a little baby. So this past Wednesday marked 10 years since her passing. And so she's been on my mind and my heart a lot. Even though she's been gone, it feels really fresh. And this sermon has been inspired by her legacy. So growing up with a Chinese mother and grandmother, I was raised understanding the importance of food. Chinese culture low-key revolves around food. The customary way of greeting someone is "Lei homa, lei sik fan mei," which literally translates to, "Are you good? Have you eaten yet?" If you've ever been to a Chinese church, you know that there's guaranteed to be a bangin' meal at the fellowship hall every week after service. Food is medicine, food is comfort, and food is an expression of love. I actually remember being slightly confused when I discovered that in white American culture, there's like a whole separate category for comfort food. It was like, we have people out here eating food that's not comforting? So when selecting a passage from the lectionary for this morning's sermon, this text jumped out at me immediately. We've got the angel of the Lord delivering food to a hopeless man and telling him to eat up. It sounds like some kind of divine VIP Grubhub deal that I really want to get in on. But let's take a closer look at this text. I'm sure you all have heard the phrase, to understand the text, you have to understand the... Yeah, this is an interactive thing. To understand the text, you have to understand the... Okay, good, y'all got it. So let's talk about what's going on before this particular incident in Elijah's life. Right before this chapter is the story of Elijah versus the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. If you don't remember, or if you haven't heard this story, basically there's this big showdown, throwdown on top of Mount Carmel where the prophet Elijah gathered King Ahab and all the people of Israel together to witness 200 prophets of the Canaanite god Baal look pretty ridiculous trying to summon him to no avail. And then they got to witness a pretty amazing miracle where the Israelite God sends down actual fire from heaven in front of everyone. Can you all just imagine for a moment if they had like Instagram back then, like you're flipping through and you're like, what is going on? So if that feat wasn't even impressive enough, that wasn't it. While everyone is packing up their lawn chairs and their coolers and they're heading back down the mountain, Elijah begins praying for rain to fall on the land. And the land has been experiencing a drought for 3 years. Miraculously, God answers Elijah's prayer and sends rain to end the drought. And this isn't just like some kind of drizzle. This is a big thunderstorm. So at this point in the story, Elijah is on a roll. He's called down both fire and rain from heaven by the power of God. My generation would say he's peaked. And that brings us to this morning's text. Queen Jezebel, who's feeling pretty salty about Elijah embarrassing the prophets of her God and putting them to death, puts a death warrant on Elijah's head. Suddenly, Elijah's not feeling so hot. So he flees. We've got a map here. It's a little bit kind of small, hard to see, but if you see the Great Sea over here on the side, that little nub that's sticking out says Mount Carmel. So that's where he was, and he flees down south, basically as far as he can go down to Beersheba, which is right under the Judah. Can you see that there? Yeah, okay. So he flees all the way down to Beersheba. And so he gets to Beersheba, and then he actually leaves his servant there and wanders by himself completely alone at that point, even further south into, down there, I don't know if you can read it, it says the Negev, which is the desert. And so by that point, he gets to the Negev desert, and he's exhausted, he's completely alone, and he's completely defeated. The narrator illustrates Elijah's despondency so powerfully through the story's geographical setting. Does anyone want to take a guess where the name Negev comes from? No guesses. Okay, I didn't know either. I had to look it up. So the name Negev comes from the Hebrew word for dry, which is very funny. It's like not only is it a desert, it's like dried, right? It's a very much of an emphasis on how dry this wilderness place is. I've actually been there, and I can attest to just how dry the Negev desert is. Okay, another question for you. Y'all should know this one. What is the lowest place on earth? Dead Sea. Good. I did have to look that one up too. What is the Dead Sea? And if you can look on the map here, it says the Salt Sea, but that's the Dead Sea. And so he's going from Mount Carmel, basically like a mountaintop experience on a mountain, and he flees all the way down to the land of the Dead Sea, the land of death, the lowest point on earth, the dry Negev desert. It's very, very symbolic. It doesn't really get much more symbolic than that unless you're reading Pilgrim's Progress or something. But I want us to hear this particular part of the text again and take in its heaviness. Verse 4 says, "He went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. There he asked that he might die. He said, 'It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors.'" Those words are the words of a desperate man, the words of a man who has given up completely. The text tells us that he lays himself down at that point in utter defeat to simply await his death. Now, I don't know about you, but lately I resonate quite a lot with this kind of deep despair. I can empathize with Elijah's sense of utter hopelessness in the face of great evil. Yes, he has seen God do some mighty miracles, but at the end of the day, it kind of seems pointless. Ahab, who the scriptures testify was the most wicked and cruel ruler in Israel's history, is still on the throne. The people of Israel were impressed by his stunt on Mount Carmel for a minute, but the nation's memory and attention span seems pretty short. At the end of the day, they're still all following Ahab and worshiping a false god. So Elijah wonders, what's the point of prophesying anymore? What's the point of seeking justice and seeking God anymore? Some of us may also feel like we are in a desert place like this. Indeed, we may even feel like we are at the site of death. Even whether or not our personal lives are faring well, I'm sure I don't need to say much to remind you of the genocide in Sudan, the crisis going on at our border, the massive ICE raids that the man who rules our country ordered to begin today in Chicago and all across the country, and then the whole deal about how human civilization is slated to become extinct because of the climate apocalypse, probably within my lifetime. Especially for those of us who are committed to healing and justice work, it's often hard not to feel utter despair. So I want us to take a look at how God responds to Elijah in his moment of despair. It's so beautiful. God does three things. The first we find in the very next verse, verse 5. It says, "Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, 'Get up and eat.'" Get up and eat. The very first response of God to Elijah's suffering and depression is to provide physical nourishment. It's worth noting that there are no words of condemnation here, no words of judgment. God does not question Elijah's commitment or shame him for burning out First, God says, eat. During the years my papa lived with our family, I can remember countless times I wandered into the kitchen, and she was somehow always in the kitchen. If I was looking even the slightest bit sad, I was always met with an offer or insistence, of my favorite noodles or some other dish. And she would say, fine, eat this. In every bowl, she was nourishing me and teaching me the importance of feeding myself. As soon as I finished my noodles, Papa would always offer more, or usually she would just put them right into my bowl. And here too, after Elijah eats the first time, God says again, get up and eat. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you. Have seconds. That is so Chinese. So first, God teaches Elijah that it is okay, it is important to care for himself, to allow his body much needed rest and nourishment. God also provides the meal so that all he has to do is get up and eat. Then and only then come the next part of this prophet's encounter with God. After Elijah is fed and rested, he actually flees even further south. And we don't actually have to bring the map up again because the point that he flees to is actually off of the map. He flees even further south to Mount Horeb. And there he meets God once again. There, God calls him back to work. God says, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. Here, God commissions Elijah to anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. This king, Jehu, would be the only king of Israel who wasn't completely horrible. He was actually the one who would wipe out the whole house of the wicked king Ahab. God is calling him to establish this person. He's calling him to something great. God never scolds Elijah for his burnout, yet God does not leave Elijah in that place. God calls him forward. My papa, too, had a beautiful way of believing in me, where she saw the good inside of me and would call that out in a way that was never shaming, never some kind of disappointment, but always in a way that was just seeing what was inside of me and calling that forward and calling that out of me. I still owe so much of who I am to what she's seen and called out of me. In the same way, God doesn't ever leave us where we're at, but God nourishes us, supports us, and calls us forward. God sees the potential we have inside of us and calls that out of us. So after feeding Elijah and restoring his call, God also offers Elijah the support of a community. You see, at this point, Elijah has completely isolated himself in the wilderness. Remember, he fled Samaria. He fled his homeland and his place of calling. He left everyone he knew. He even left his servant in Beersheba before finally wandering into the desert alone. In Elijah's mind, he is utterly alone. This is a recurring theme in his pronouncements, even beginning on Mount Carmel. As he's standing before all the people, he says, I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets number 450. And now here in verse 9, he says again, this time to God, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left. Not only is Elijah exhausted and burned out, he feels like he has no support. And so God doesn't send Elijah forward alone. God tells Elijah that on the way back up to Damascus, he will meet a young prophet named Elisha, who will be his sidekick for the next 7 years, and eventually will take up his prophetic mantle. Beyond that, God reminds Elijah that he is not alone. In verse 18, he says that there are 7,000 people in Israel who still do follow God. As I mentioned earlier, the anniversary of Papa's passing was Wednesday. So I went out to Elgin, where her grave is, and took some flowers, and I FaceTimed my family, who's in China and other parts of the country and the world, and just kind of brought us all together to commemorate her. And at one point in time, my dad said, "What do you think Papa would say to us? You know, if she was alive now, what would she say to us all here?" And immediately the rest of us said, "Of course," she would say, "Lei sik fan mei. What have you eaten yet? Hoi gay leg mat yeah, like what can I make for you? Lei sik mat yeah. What do you want to eat?" We all knew that that's what she would have done. The day before that, on Tuesday, I was helping out with one of our ministries here called LaSalle Neighbors. That's where every other Tuesday afternoon, about 70 senior neighbors will line up to receive groceries and canned goods on the lower floor of this building. My first time helping out, I hadn't anticipated there being so many Chinese-speaking seniors attending, and I had a lot of fun practicing my basic Mandarin and a little bit of Cantonese as well, and we were chatting a little bit. So this past Tuesday was my second time helping out, and seeing a few familiar faces, and at one point, one of the women who I'd spoken with a little bit just the last week came through the line, and when she saw me, she didn't say anything. She turned and she went into her bag that she'd brought for groceries, and she pulled out a box of crackers, and she handed them to me. It didn't say anything. And it was all I could do to hold my tears back in that moment. I just knew that I had been seen and met in a way I hadn't even anticipated, as in the past weeks and the days leading up to thinking about my grandmother's passing and how she would always feed me, and how I was seeing that in that text. And then here God brings this other Chinese grandma into my life in this line, and she also offers to feed me. You see, this is who God is. God says, "Get up and eat." In the face of death, God says, "Get up and eat." In the face of a troubling future, God says, "I have prepared a table for you." In the midst of uncertainty, as we face danger, God says, "Get up and eat, for the journey is long." It's a miracle, really, that every Communion Sunday, the table never fails to be set. No matter what we are all facing, the bread is broken, the wine is poured, and we are invited to the table. The table is such a perfect picture of how God meets us. Honestly, I also feel like communion is one of the most Chinese elements of church. It's so Chinese to literally schedule a food break in the middle of service to gather everyone around together to eat family style. But for real, the practice of communion reminds us how bodily our existence is. It also reminds us how communal our existence is. We share the same bread and the same cup as members of one body. We are not alone.